So again, thank you all for coming, making your way here in conditions that are less than ideal. And thank you also for those who might or not be joining us per Zoom and might or not now hear me. I also would like to thank all those who helped in putting together this conference and helping all the colleagues and team members from the Katholische Akademie. I would like to start by introducing a little to the conference. I remind you that again we are now opening a conference, but we are now also opening an evening event that will include 2 lectures that I will get to that, which will be streamed live so people can hear us. But I will start by saying something more general about the conference, some words of introduction on the context and the topic, and then I will also say something about the evening events and introduce the evening speakers. Hopefully by then 2 of them will be here. So the whole question of presence is already in the spirit of political theology. The question of presence and absence is already, we're already performing it. So first about the context. The context is that this conference is one of the big annual events of a new initiative that we started here in Berlin that carries the somewhat paradoxical title, the Berlin Center for Intellectual Diaspora. And I want to say some things about this initiative so you can situate yourself and the event within that. The project is hosted by the Katholische Akademie Berlin. We are now sitting in the rooms, in the spaces of the Katholische Akademie Berlin, which is a center that organizes, that holds public discussions on religion, politics, culture, and society. And it is within the Katholische Akademie that we started this new initiative, the Berlin Center for Intellectual Diaspora. Now, the basic idea of this initiative is to have here in Berlin a space for something like critical thought, critical engagement, intellectual engagement on contemporary questions of public interest, concerning mainly politics, religion, culture, society. And this program is guided a little like a regulative Kantian idea, guided by the idea or by the notion of diaspora, or if you wish, exile. The title is diaspora, but we can broaden it. We try to be guided by these notions, and what we think, what we try to perform or to organize around these notions is something like an existential, political, geographical condition of intellectuality, of intellectual activity. And one way of orienting ourselves in doing so is Edward Said's idea of the existential condition of the intellectual who criticize, who try to critique rather society, is both at the same time belonging to a place or to a context or cultural or political context, but also not belonging, also being in exile from this context. Now, when we take and try to make this idea operative in this space of the Katholische Akademie, we try to draw inspiration first and foremost from different attempts made in various Catholic and Jewish traditions, as well as in other intellectual traditions, attempts of creating precisely these paradoxical diasporic places and, if you wish, institutions, namely something like centers of dispersions or centers of contestation. Hello, Oliver Hidalgo. So now the two speakers of the evening are with us. This is the inspiration, this is the idea, this is the attempt, a vision, if you wish, of the center of this initiative. And what we try to do is to realize, to give content and substance to this vision through organizing events like these, encounters that bring intellectuals from different places, different disciplines, different questions, to this center of diaspora. We do it under 4 titles, 4 domains that we chose for as kind of conceptual centers for our activity, and they are cultures of difference, religion and democracy, diasporic knowledge, and political theology. If you look at our website, these are the 4 Schwerpunkte. This year, the first year of activity, 2021, we had a few weeks ago a big conference on Kulturkampf. Last week we had a workshop on Talmud and contemporary thought. And in December, we're holding a conference on diasporic knowledge. All of you who will be here in December are warmly invited. And now, our conference, Political Theology, Now, Why? That was the title that we sent to you, and thank you very much for agreeing to contribute to this search, to this conversation. It's an attempt to start a conversation, basically. This is the idea of this center and this conference. Now, you all read, at least those who are sitting here, you all read the description of the conference, so I don't need to repeat it. I will just remind you that this idea of starting a conversation on political theology, now, why, has, of course, in it a certain kairos in it, right? The now idea. There is a certain reference to something that is perceived as happening, and this is precisely the presence of political theology as a topos, as a locus of intellectual and also beyond intellectual cultural discussions, which seems to have been on the rise for a few decades now, definitely characterizing a new conversation after 89, collapse of communism, and then again in the post 9/11 era, political theology seems to be more and more and ever present. And when I say now political theology, I mean people actually talking, writing, doing things that are called political theology or theopolitics, but you can also expand it to more broader field of intellectual attempts to think the relation between religion and politics, or rather to rethink the relation between religion, politics, and society. And in this context, as our offer for conversation continues, we also connect it to something that can be called a conversation about post-secularism or a post-secularist condition, which is some kind of a ongoing critique of the discourse of secularism as a central element in the performance of what understands itself to be a modern West, or a Western modernity, or modernity that is the West. Secularism, namely this operation of the modern West, enacts a certain break, a certain constitutive break with the non-modern and the non-West as religious. Okay, secularism is an act, is a performance of something that becomes modern West, that breaks in order to define itself from its other that is non-modern and non-West as religious, namely as the non-secular. So it seems that this basic constitutive performance of the modern West through secularism is being reevaluated, rethought, revisited in today's post-secular turn. There is a kind of reevaluation of modernity that is underway. And in this context, of course, this reevaluation calls for, and in fact gives space to a recourse, a revisitation of pre-modern traditions such as Jewish, Catholic, and Islamic. And this is something that is very central to, I think, to many of the things that are happening in this center, and definitely something that motivates this conference on political theology. Now, why? The attempt, again, is to open a conversation on this, inviting you to reflect together with us on this situation, offer your perspective, and this is what we will be hearing in the next 2 days. Different reflections, perspective on what kind of questions, what kind of themes, and what kind of directions are important to talk about in this context, with the hope of starting a conversation that will continue over the next years. I will finish my introduction just by making a observation on a certain connection that might be found between political theology and something that tries to be a center for intellectual diaspora. And this is precisely the notion of absence with which I started the talk here, and which is through this technology and through the movement and delays is being very present, absence that is present. It seems that if you go back to at least important formulations of political theology, such as Carl Schmitt, we talked about it, Vivian. Interestingly, this connection between religion and politics is not predicated on enacting divine presence in culture and politics, but enacting divine absence within politics, namely enacting something that might be called, if we want to talk with the Center for Intellectual Diaspora, enacting a condition of divine diaspora or divine galut. So that's just a reflection on why political theology is something that a Center for Intellectual Diaspora in Berlin would like to talk about. This is by way of introduction, conceptual introduction. And now I would be happy to move to the specific event of this evening, our public panel on, the title is Political Theology and Secular Thought. Before I do that, I will get the okay from the technology people that the timing is right to start this event. Yeah, the live stream and everything is. Yeah, okay, very good. So we are on a good timing. So we start the conversation with two guests, Vivian Liska and Oliver Hidalgo, who just made it, but made it. And I think what we'll do, we'll have the two lectures one after the other. First, Vivian is announcing the program, and then Oliver. And I will present each one of you before you speak. And then after the two lectures, we'll hold a discussions, questions, and so forth. So I will start with Vivian Liska, who is a professor of German literature and the director of the Institute of Jewish Studies at the University of Antwerp, Belgium. She is also, since 2013, distinguished visiting professor in the Faculty of the Humanities at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her research focuses on literary theory, German modernism, and German Jewish authors and thinkers. She is the editor of the book series Perspectives on Jewish Texts and Contexts in the Guiter Berlin, local, co-editor of the yearbook of the Society for European Jewish Literature, and Arcadia, International Journal of Literary Studies. Her recent book publications include Giorgio Agamben's Lehrer Messianismus, When Kafka Says We, Uncommon Communities in German Jewish Literature, and German Jewish Thought and Its Afterlife, a tenuous legacy. And Vivian, thank you very much for being with us tonight. Vivian will talk about Abraham's agency, Arendt, Kafka, and human rights. Please, Vivian.
Good evening, and first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks a lot. Thanks to the other organizers. Thanks to you all for being here. I will start with some preliminary reflections. I'm well aware that invoking Hannah Arendt as a first lecture at a conference exploring the current state and fate of political theology is far from self-evident. She has often been regarded as one of the German Jewish thinkers furthest removed from theological concerns, and certainly from the intersection between politics and theology. So before addressing this question and hoping to contribute to recent challenges of this view, a few general remarks and thoughts about my own approach to political theology. Political theology is, even now that it is everywhere, still a very vaguely circumscribed field. The range of meaning covered by the term can best be described in light of Carl Schmitt's use of the term, maybe precisely there where one desires to move away from it. So Schmitt's famous dictum that, quote, all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological ones, and the consequences Schmitt drew from this statement. There is something to be said about Schmitt's dictum. Possibly, indeed, modern politics cannot escape from its theological remnants for the simple reason that, certainly, but not only in the West, the organization of society and of nations, the arrangements of power, war, and peace, were for so long conceptualized in metaphysical, theological, and religious terms. Schmitt, however, to my mind, adopted the very worst of such remnants by modeling sovereignty on an omnipotent divinity, by endowing a human ruler with transposed, secularized divine characteristics, and by granting that ruler the power to suspend the law at will, and by exacerbating an antagonistic rift between friend and enemy, between us and them, as in believers and unbelievers. So these are not Schmidt's categories, but that too serves for him as a kind of model. A very different approach to political theology, one that I embrace, searches in religious traditions for those elements and maybe even fundamental principles that can illuminate our present, can shed light on the shortcomings of modernity, and can contribute to a meaningful participation in what Arendt called our common world building. As recent research has shown, Arendt dealt intensely with Schmidt's thought. Her annotations of his books constitute an unwritten yet elaborate critique of his views. In what follows, I hope to show that Arendt epitomizes an approach to political theology that can counteract Schmidt's, while sharing with him certain points of departure, including a certain idea of secularization of theological material, as well as the quasi-ubiquity of the political. Her thoughts point in the opposite direction. Unlike Schmidt's dictum, which would make the religious residues in modernity inescapable, so that's his dictum that all elements, all concepts, all political concepts are really secularized theological ones. So that would make it inescapable. Arendt, by contrast, regards the realm of the theological as a reservoir of treasures to revert to and recover for a politics defined by the possibility and necessity of a politics divested of precisely that kind of sovereignty that Schmidt envisages, and is instead based on a relational model of care for a common world. Now, when I say a reservoir of treasures, I am well aware that many others who do something similar to Arendt, I believe, wouldn't agree with that term treasures. I am referring here to her reference to Shakespeare's pearls and corals that she claims Walter Benjamin dives for in the depth of the sea. But I always wondered whether Benjamin would agree with such a precious imagery. So far, my preliminary thoughts. Arendt's lifelong striving for a secular politics makes the endeavor of an exploration of her work from the perspective of political theology all the more exciting. In the past 20 years, scholars occasionally and increasingly paid attention to the theological dimensions in Arendt's oeuvre. An early example is Susan Neiman's Theodicy in Jerusalem from 2001, a reading of Arendt's Eichmann book as a reflection on evil in religious terms. More recent and elaborate explorations of a theological dimension in Arendt's thought are exemplified by a book about to come out, edited by Raphael Savissa and Ludger Hagedorn, called Faith in the World, the Post-Secular Readings of Hannah Arendt, with, and I'm very pleased to be able to say this here now, extremely important participation and contribution by Agatha Willig-Robson. Scholars, I have read, but this is also an article that is only about to come out, a fascinating study on the Eichmann book that opens up the new perspective, at least new to me, that all the criticism that Arendt got for this book, especially by Jews, notwithstanding, one can read her Eichmann book in Talmudic terms and discover that her critique of the Judenräte very much conforms with the ideas that one finds in the Talmud concerning the way to act in the face of violent dictatorship that claims members of this community to be handed over to the powers. Really interesting and unexpected finding that I believe only opens up a parallel that one could find between Talmudic elements and Arendt's thought. So scholars have illuminated Arendt's theological imagination as a driving force underlying the pillars of her thought in her conceptualization of key notions of her thought ranging from natality's singularity to political pluralism, from her idea of amor mundi to inter esse. The contribution of religious, mystical, or scriptural figures and motifs helping her to articulate the imperative of human empowerment come to light. One has discussed, for instance, the mystical idea of Adamite origin that nurtures Arendt's insistence on human plurality, and the shift from God to the world prefigured in Luriani Kabbalah that preceded her philosophical turn from mortality to the singularity of natality. A non-absolute conception of God found in heterodox religious streams grounds the faith in one's phenomenal existence as strong and thus guarantees the limitations of political sovereignty within the body politic. What emerges from a focus on this dimension of her work, and I would love to, but will refrain from giving away some of Agatha's profound reflections on the topic, are the residues of a religious tradition that survived the rupture caused by modernity, a rupture on which Arendt indeed insisted, and that fundamentally impacts the presumed radical secularity of Arendt's thought. The survival can be seen in the context of a crypto-theological immigration into the profane practiced by some of her German Jewish contemporaries, such as Theodor Adorno, Walter Benjamin, Scholem, or Franz Kafka. In this context, an association of Arendt's presumably most secular critique of the discourse on human rights with the Bible, and of this ostensibly political discourse with the literary work of Franz Kafka, can, I believe, yield insights that point to the ubiquitous theological bedrock subtending the most resilient aspects of Arendt's oeuvre. In a book titled Placeless People from 2018, it's a literary history of modern statelessness. Lindsay Stonebridge states that Arendt's, quote, critique of human rights was forged, at least in part, from her reading of fiction, and in particular from the work she did on Kafka in the mid-1940s. Stonebridge refers to Arendt's essay from 1944, The Jewish Pariah, and Franz Kafka, A Revaluation. These two texts approach the Prague author in the context of exile, homelessness, and the vulnerability of the stranger, a situation Arendt herself faced in those years. These essays prefigure the critique of human rights that Arendt would formulate a few years later in The Decline of the Nation-State and the End of the Rights of Man. There she points to the weakness of human rights when and where they are needed most. So that's her famous critique of human rights. Dependent for their implementation upon the status of citizenship and the nation-state, they fail to protect the stateless, the refugees, and more generally, those who don't belong to a legal entity that can enforce these rights. Stonebridge describes Arendt's use of Kafka as a thought experiment that contrasts past rightlessness with what Stonebridge calls a different kind of political and ethical community, a possible future. Stonebridge's insight into Arendt's use of Kafka to diagnose the ills of human rights is illuminating. But her affirmation of Arendt's view that Kafka's fiction provides a cure for these tribulations is less plausible. Arendt does indeed depict Kafka's protagonists, particularly the land surveyor Kay in the castle, as ultimate strangers, as embodiments of the vulnerability experienced by those who belong nowhere, are not recognized by anyone, and are, in Kafka's words, nobodies and nothings. These human non-entities serve as a literary adumbration of Arendt's portrayal of the stateless, those who are left defenseless in the face of rising nationalism and its exclusionary and homogenizing politics. Arendt's analysis of the plight of Kafka's protagonists is compelling. But her own suggestion that he also delivers solutions, visions of a new social order that would guarantee such rights, is questionable. This is not to say that Kafka's figures have no potential impact on their world at all. Arendt formulates this potential succinctly in her reading of The Castle as a minimal yet crucial act of resistance. Arendt portrays Kay's distinguishing feature as a refusal to submit to the castle's authority. She can give only scant evidence for this feature of Kafka's protagonist. Indeed, the novel offers barely more than hints to his resistance. He mainly thrives to gain access to the castle and to confront its authorities. In a later reference to Kafka, Arendt intuits that she must go a step further than Kafka to align him with her own vision of the possibilities for political intervention. I'm referring here to her text Between Past and Future. It's the introduction to that book, where she invokes Kafka's heir, he, and describes the situation of the man who is caught between forces that push him forward and forces that push him back, and he's squeezed between them. And in Kafka text, it says that he, in a night darker than any other night, dreams of jumping out. And Arendt says, no, we have to go a step beyond Kafka. The description is wonderful of this place of being squeezed, but what you have to do there is not dream the old, she calls that the old metaphysical dream of jumping out, but you ought to stay there and create a parallelogram a space where she situates thinking, and it's the kind of thinking that indeed can make a difference in the way things will proceed into the future. So that is where this idea that Arendt says she must go a step further than Kafka comes from. Surprisingly, however, Arendt and Kafka find common ground in their reference to the biblical figure of Abraham. And this is where I get to the idea of political theology as having recourse to a theological world. Both Arendt and Kafka invoke Abraham's confrontation with divine authority, and both derive from his attitude the indispensable starting point to conceive of human rights. That, first of all, no one is a nobody. By virtue of being somebody, everybody, even the lowliest of human beings, can contest the reigning authority and thereby intervene in the world. Even a perfunctory reading of Arendt's The Jew as Pariah reveals its vicinity to her early writings about human rights, a term she repeatedly mentions in her essay. The introduction to this essay assesses the pariah as a human type who is refused admission to the ranks of humanity. In the final section of the essay, Arendt portrays the land surveyor Kay as the man of goodwill who wants nothing else but the right to live a decent life and to be admitted into a society that persists in excluding him. In the village dominated by the opaque powers of the castle, Kay remains a powerless outsider. Alone in his hopeless efforts, he ultimately ends up exhausted. For Arendt, Kafka's novel points to the hopelessness of the exiled, the homeless, and displaced, as well as to all those who believe that playing along or blending into the established society can solve their plight. Arendt writes of the protagonist of the castle. K finally comes to understand that the realization of his designs, the achievements of basic human rights, the right to work, to be useful, the right to found a home and become a member of society, are in no way dependent on complete assimilation to one's milieu, on being indistinguishable. In Arendt's view, K's exhaustion results from the failures of a system that did not protect him and a community that did not grant him access. Yet Arendt suggests that his presence in the village did bring about a significant change. He left the villagers with the sense that confrontation is possible. K pointed out the bankruptcy of the world of the castle as a bureaucratic society that demands subordination and assimilation. She writes, "The very fight he had put up to obtain the few basic things which society owes to man had opened the eyes of the villagers, or at least some of them. His story, his behavior, had taught them both that human rights are worth fighting for, and that the rule of the castle is not divine law, and consequently can be attacked. In the allusion to the basic things which society owes to men, the Benjaminian insistence resonates that it is not mere life, but a life worth living that is sacred." If we think of Arendt's crypto-theological imagination, and here I would like to very briefly invoke Agatha's argument about birth as the factor that transforms mere life into an unnatural human one. And I'm quoting her. "If she often comes across as hostile to the notion of sheer survival, it is only for the sake of supporting a life articulated and maintained by the tradition of life." It seems to be such an articulation of the meaning of a life, which is more than just natural being, and which society in Kafka's castle denies to men. Arendt distinguishes between the rule of the castle and divine law. So in the quote by Arendt that I read before, that the rule of the castle is not divine law and consequently can be attacked. So this distinction that she makes between the rule of the castle and divine law implicitly suggests that divine law is beyond contestation. This distinction, however, contrasts with Arendt's reference elsewhere to a biblical passage in which the individual is empowered to intervene in God's ways. So there is a contradiction between the terms in which she describes Kafka's castle and another place, namely the human condition, where Arendt reflects on the mutual covenantal promise God gave to Abraham. And I'm quoting. It's in the section on promises. "We may trace the binding status of the promise back to the Roman legal system, the inviolability of agreements and treaties, pacta sunt servanda. Or we may see its discoverer, so the discoverer of the meaning of the promise, the binding status of the promise. Or we may see its discoverer in Abraham, the man from Ur, whose whole story, as the Bible tells it, shows such a passionate drive toward making covenants that it is, and this is the key sentence, that it is as though he, Abraham, departed from his country for no other reason than to try out the power of mutual promise in the wilderness of the world, until eventually God himself agreed to make a covenant with him. So this is a somewhat unusual reading of Lech Lecha. It is not that God commands and Abraham goes as full submission, but Abraham goes, and when God sees that Abraham got up and left, that's how he brought him into making a covenant. Kierkegaard, whose works influenced Arendt in her youth, regarded Abraham as the embodiment of submission and a knight of faith. In contrast, Arendt stages Abraham as a daring challenger of God. In her version, Abraham sets out into the wilderness without guarantee that God will keep his word to give him progeny and provide his descendants with a homeland. Leaving his place of birth and venturing into the desert, he subjects himself and his progeny to the risk of becoming a stranger in a land that is not theirs. Abraham compels God to keep his side of the promise and thereby becomes the forefather of those who hold authority, even ultimate authority, to account. To quote Agatha again, Arendt's conception of faith comes close to its Hebrew meaning of emunah, trust in the reliability of the covenant. In this case, solid relation with the world as the arena of a good finite life. Authority is, one could add, accountable to provide the conditions of this life. In the words of one critic, Arendt's portrayal of Abraham as the one who challenged God into making a covenant turns him into the initiator of law as politically binding. More importantly, Abraham thereby becomes an active agent who forces God into keeping his side of the promise. As a result, Abraham becomes the forefather of those who indeed ask of sovereignty to, and not just ask, demand of sovereignty, to be accountable and to act upon this right, even in the face of the ultimate power. Arendt's reading might somewhat overstate Abraham's action about God's designs, but it undeniably captures a fundamental insight. Through the figure of Abraham, the Bible suggests a mutual covenant freely engaged in by man and affirms the ineluctable participation of human action in shaping the world. In this sense, Abraham is also a somewhat more successful precursor of Kafka's K as seen by Abraham, a figure she calls a fabricator mundi, a world builder who can get rid of misconstructions and reconstruct the world. It can seem overly optimistic to call Kafka's K an architect of the world. A more modest version of this claim would be that the Bible affords man the right to stand up for himself and expect accountability of the powers that be. This claim represents, in its own right, a significant step toward the preconditions of human rights. And now to Kafka's Abraham. I can imagine another Abraham. This is the first sentence of a text Kafka included in a letter to Robert Klopstock in June 1921. Kafka's remark, even more directly than Arendt's, responds to Kierkegaard's praise of Abraham's submissiveness. Kafka imagines another Abraham, one who, unlike the biblical one, would not ascend Mount Moriah to sacrifice his beloved son. Like the biblical patriarch, Kafka's other Abraham is a pious man who would be ready to execute the command to sacrifice Isaac, as it says famously, with the promptness of a waiter. Kafka's Abraham, however, would still never be able to perform the sacrifice. In an imaginary reply to God, his Abraham argues that, quote, he cannot get away from home. He is indispensable. The household needs him. There's always something that must be attended to. The house isn't finished. Later, Kafka elaborates on Abraham's excuses for procrastinating rather than obeying God's command. His other Abraham now stands in the plural. He has become a type, or better yet, an existential attitude. The other Abrahams, and I'm quoting, they stand on their building sites and suddenly are supposed to go to Mount Moriah. These Abrahams, as imagined by Kafka, are called by God while attending to their home, their world building. As much as Kafka's other Abrahams would otherwise have been willing to oblige, they declare themselves too immersed in the care of their house to heed the divine summons. Kafka speculates about the motivation of this refusal. And I quote, "All we can do is suspect that these men are deliberately not finishing their houses so as not to have to lift their eyes and see the mountain that stands in the distance. Rather than staring at the awesome mountain of sacrifice, these Abrahams turn this house, the world, into an infinite and infinitely improvable building site. The immaterial foundations of this house manifest themselves in the story as a politely irreverent refusal of the sacrificial logic Abraham is summoned to obey, a logic that the Bible itself, in halting Abraham's knife, ultimately rejects. As in Arendt's depiction of Abraham's action, Kafka's other Abraham affirms the Bible's own foundation in human freedom to act upon the world. In my preliminary remarks, I announced that my choice of approaching the question of political theology with Arendt can serve to counteract Carl Schmitt's understanding of this term. The path I've taken and the positions for which I argue are in crucial ways opposed to the Schmittian doctrine and its followers. Against the idea of a sovereign ruler conceived as a secularized instance of an omnipotent God who can suspend the law at will and decides freely and arbitrarily, both Kafka and Arendt conceive of a relational God bound by a mutual covenantal spirit. Where Schmitt's godlike sovereign decides, in his own words, by, quote, pure decision, not based on reason or discussion, and not justifying itself, nicht resonierend, nicht diskutierend, nicht sich rechtfertigend, that is, to an absolute decision created out of nothing, end of quote. The Abrahams I invoked presuppose a relationship between the human and the divine that is precisely covenantal and dialogic. The political theology that can be derived from this point of departure is not only divergent from Schmitt's, it is its antidote. Importantly, these are not random fictional inventions. However far Arendt and Kafka's portrayals of Abraham deviate from the biblical text, they are not arbitrary distortions. Abraham's negotiations with God are laid out in the Bible itself. The patriarchs haggling with God, as in the context of the divine plan to destroy Sodom, prefigures other biblical figures wrestling with divine authority, foremost among them Moses, as well as some prophets, and most hauntingly the suffering Job. In attributing the right to contest the existing legal, moral, or political authority to Abraham, the model of righteousness, the Bible grants man the right to speak up for himself and protest in the face of injustice. This freedom is not only a foundation of human rights, but also a potential inherent in and central to literature, another locus of the immigration of theological contents into the profane realm. Human rights are not rendered obsolete by their weakness, such as their powerlessness to be enforced, dependence on extraneous legal entities, vulnerability to abuse, and their inevitable biased implementation. These constitutive weaknesses, still with us today, are manifestations of the necessarily utopian nature of the entire human rights endeavor and symptoms of the impossibility to conclusively rectify the world, that is, to finish Abraham's house. The contributions that human rights make to improve it are indisputable, but they remain a precarious and perennial construction site. Kafka suggests that his Abrahams have good reason to deliberately build houses that cannot be finished. It would, however, be a mistake to regard Kafka's and Arendt's reading of Abraham as either simply transgressive or radically secular. Arendt's Abraham sets out on the road in a reliance on God's promise, in focusing on improving the worldly building site. Kafka's Abraham doesn't deny that the mountain is there in the distance. he asserts the primacy of his world building in a dialogue with God. It is true that he averts his eyes from the fear and trembling inspired by the mountain and the way it might be a sacrificial site. Approaching his gesture too narrowly, however, may prevent us from seeing this site as the place where, early on, along with the law and the commandments, the right to stand up for oneself and hold authority accountable, which is a precondition for human rights, was also accorded. This Abraham continues to toil on his building site, but Arendt, like Kafka, went further and defiantly included the mountain in the distance and their negotiations with its master, including them within their vision of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian. Thank you very much, Vivian, for this Abrahamic reflection through Arendt and Kafka on the perhaps biblical under structure of human rights. As I announced at the beginning, we will wait with I'm sure many questions that you have, and we will directly move to the second speaker of this evening, Oliver Hidalgo, that I will quickly present. And after Oliver's talk, we'll open a discussion where you can refer, ask, reflect on both talks, each in itself and in their connection. Oliver, thank you for being here. Oliver Hidalgo from the University of Munster. He's a professor for political science and researcher at the Universities of Munster and Regensburg on issues related to political theory and the history of ideas, democratic theory and the relationship between politics and religion. Oliver is the spokesman of the Standing Group on Politics and Religion of the German Political Science Association, and he will talk to us tonight on political theology and the secular two sides of the same coin, question mark. Please, Oliver.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to speak here. I'm very glad to be here after a 2 hours delay with the German Bundesbahn. The debate concerning political theology in the German context, and we have heard about it before, observed at least two milestones. The intellectual struggle between Carl Schmitt and Erich Peterson during the Weimar Republic, respectively the Third Reich, and the controversy between the exponents of a new political theology, Johann Baptist Metz or Jürgen Moltmann, and critics of such an approach as, for example, Hans Meyer. In the shadow of this second controversy during the late 1860s and early 1960s and the early 1970s, there was also a very enlightening encounter on the field of political theology between Carl Schmitt and Hans Blumenberg, showing or maybe confirming that the concept of political theology and the idea of the secular might be deeply intertwined. What were all these struggles about? At first glance, the main topic of the concept of political theology, of course, is the question if theology and religion imply or maintain a political dimension, even under secular circumstances. But here, an interesting observation to remark is as following. None of the intellectual opponents mentioned before, neither Schmitt, Peterson, or Blumenberg, nor Metz, Moltmann, or Meyer, denied that theology and religion are politically relevant or even essentially important. Thus, a second glance might come to the conclusion that the main issue of political theology is what kind of political impact of religion and theology is still legitimate under the conditions of the democratic state and the rule of law. And I would admit this is definitely a very characteristic implication in the realm of political theology, but I think that the core of the whole debate goes even further. I think that political theology first and foremost deals with the challenge to understand what is the secular at all. And in this respect, and in order to present my considerations in these concerns, I will also start, of course, with the famous introduction to the third chapter of Carl Schmitt's Political Theology, where we can read that, and we have heard it before, all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, not only because of their historical development, in which they were transferred from theology to the theory of the state, whereby, for example, the omnipotent God became the omnipotent lawgiver, but also because of their systematic structure, the recognition of which is necessary for sociological consideration of these concepts. Obviously, in this quoted passage, as well as in the whole book, it was the main goal of Schmitt to restore an authoritarian state by suggesting that there is a deep analogy between theistic and autocratic, deistic and liberal, pantheistic and democratic, and finally atheistic and anarchical attitudes. Proceeding from this analogy, Schmitt attempted to illustrate the liberal rule of law as well as modern democracy as inadmissible outcomes of a preceding pathology in the field of theology. Through this lens, only a sovereign autocracy embodies and represents a political system based upon an intact image of God. In contrast, the liberal state, which binds the lawgiver to the law itself, or also the rule of the people, destroying the hierarchy between rulers and the ruled, seem to be the consequence of a kind of theological illness, which, at least according to Schmitt's own premises, continues as a form of political weakness. But apart from this politically very problematic and dangerous aim, Schmitt's considerations made at least one point which is undoubtedly decisive for our contemporary understanding of politics and its relationship to theological sources. The secular world is still impregnated by theological and religious influences, formations, images, and performances, far from being essentially separated from religion. Of course, we can rely on Erik Peterson and do not have to agree with Schmitt and to assume that such a direct reverberation of theological patterns in the sphere of politics is really necessary. On the other hand, it is definitely one of Schmitt's greatest merits to draw our attention to the issue that, particularly under secular conditions, the two spheres of religion and politics are mutually related to each other. In this way, we can interpret Schmitt's innovation in a way that political theology means first a focus acting against any strict or pure theory of secular monetization, claiming that traditional religions and theologies will disappear in the future, as for instance the positivist thinker Auguste Comte predicted in the 19th century. Second, that modernity and the secular can only be understood along with the theological backgrounds and sources, or rather precisely by the previous or corresponding developments and changes in the field of theological matters. Third, that theology and religion still play a decisive role in secular modernity, epistemologically and politically. Therefore, that the way we think religion and theology anticipates and prefigures our attitude to politics. Fourth, that theology and religion cannot be misunderstood or reduced as being a just private phenomenon, but will always have a political impact, although the institutions of religion and theology on the one hand and state and politics on the other could or should be separated. And finally, the concept of political theology opens the floor to distinguish the various political meanings and impacts of different religions and confessions, and therefore basically provide a comparative perspective within the field of politics and religion. However, although Schmitt provides a quite convincing concept of political theology in order to grasp the inevitable interactions between the religious and the political sphere, his approach was nevertheless very one-sided. He was only able to observe that religion and politics cannot be differentiated in a manner that gives them completely dissimilar characters, functions, and logics in the modern era. But as, for instance, Jakob Taubes once pointed out, Schmidt was more or less blind for the fact that political theology means always both an intersection and separation of the religious and the political sphere in secular societies. Otherwise, the semantic construction of political theology would not make any sense if we assume some more or less congruent phenomena under the same semantic field. In other words, to become able to ask for the intersections between politics and religion presupposes first to abstract both spheres from each other and to differentiate them conceptually. For Taubes, this also meant that we must not follow Schmidt and confuse, or maybe better equate, the multi-layered concept of political theology with the one-sided totalitarian amalgamation of the political and the religious sphere, but rather acknowledge the necessity of a separation of powers between the secular and the spiritual. Moreover, Schmidt overlooked the inner variability and plurality of political convictions spreading from one and the same religion and theology. Thus, he suggested that one's imagination of God does determine, more or less, one's political attitude without being aware of the fact that in all religions and theologies we may observe different interpretations of the political impact of theology, liberal and communitarian ones, progressive and conservative, and also tolerant and radical. Hence, we may conclude, loosely based on Jan Assmann, that it was rather Schmidt's political perceptions and preferences, hierarchy, authority, homogeneity, and anti-pluralism, shaping his picture of theology, especially of Roman Catholicism, of course, then conversely deriving his concept of the political, the dichotomy between friends and enemies, from theology. In sum, both Schmidt's insight as well as his obvious shortcomings demonstrate that political theology predominantly combines a double character, that is, a parallel distinction and overlapping of the political and the religious sphere, or also of formations of the secular and the spiritual. The second part of my argument, dealing with the aforementioned second stage of the German debate concerning political theology between Metz and Meyer, will definitely confirm the conclusion we have already drawn from the previous discussion between Schmidt and Taubes. In order to prove that, I will refer to Hans Meyer's critique on the social revolutionist left-wing variety of political theology by Johann Baptist Metz, launched in 2 articles Meyer published in Stimmen der Zeit in February 1969 and March 1970. Regarding this, Meyer's contribution to the debate on political theology must be rated highly, since his commitment demonstrates that the issue of political theology is beyond any intra-theological problem. By speaking as a political scientist, Meyer reopened the political horizon from which the term political theology actually originates. Furthermore, Meyer's explanations do not revolve solely around the question of the possibly public dimension of the religious and theological, but rather around the basic relationship between the spiritual and the secular sphere. But let us start from the beginning. The whole debate began as in 1968, the Catholic theologian Metz published his book Zur Theologie der Welt. Here, especially in the essay Church and World in the Light of a Political Theology, Metz emphasized the practical and worldly claim that arises from the Gospels as well as from the Christian faith derived from them. In an intellectual exchange with liberation theology and the tradition of Catholic social teaching, Metz stylized a religious mission to revolutionize and humanize the world against the well-known prejudice of Orthodox Marxism that religion is nothing but an opium for the people. Meyer's argument against Metz is threefold. First, he insisted that the term political theology being introduced by Carl Schmitt is fundamentally misleading in order to express the, in itself, legitimate concern of a public voice of religion and Christianity. Second, Meyer stated that Metz's political idea of the Church as an institution of social critique remains problematic in itself, since it can neither be defined or legitimated politically nor theologically. And third and finally, Meyer identified a lot of institutional and practical obstacles in order to realize a political theology in the sense of Metz. For our discourse, of course, the first argument is the most important. Nevertheless, it is advisable to roll up Mayer's argument from behind, because his last argument refers above all to the increasingly secular environment, which makes the political theology Metz had in mind practically unfeasible. Not only are the churches not entitled, I quote, to prescribe to the faithful their concrete political behavior, one should not forget that in the multi-religious present of the secular world, a Christian political theology would not unite society but divide it. Hence, there was, for Meyer, the danger that Metz's political theology turns into a secular substitute for religion, or even an intolerant dogmatic Biblicism. However, for Meyer, the problem begins even earlier, since a politically critical role of the church Metz appreciates and Meyer himself supports as being crucial for modern society, requires nothing but its independence from all appropriations by political institutions of the state. In other words, it is once again the synchronous separation and intertwinement of politics and religion which is decisive here, and which Meyer just not associates with the concept of political theology. In contrast, Meyer was afraid that both spheres, the political and the religious one, would lose their particular character if they were tied together too closely. For the same reason, Meyer strongly discourages the application of the term political theology and proposes instead to refer to the French term Theologie publique. In this way, he hopes to express an emphasis on the public character of the Christian message, in contrast to the pathos of religious inwardness he discovers most of all in Kierkegaard. While Meyer considers the concept of political theology to be prejudiced in this respect, can be illustrated by a basic problem that he developed at the very beginning of his article. Here he recalls the ancient origins of the concept in Varro, who translated the Greek Theologia Politica as Theologia Civilis. However, as St. Augustine and his followers had underlined, Christianity had broken up for good reasons with this convergence of the state and the divine, and of politics and religious cults. Therefore, the idea of the world transcendent Christian God was exactly directed against the idea of a theological political immanence. And the revival of the latter in the modern age provokes for Meyer an unauthorized theologization of existing forms of state and society, even to the point of their religious idolization. Altogether, Meyer's main critique is that Metz proposes a politicization of Christian salvation, identifying religion as a kind of political order. And in this way, Meyer does not recognize any essential difference between the new and the old political theology. For Meyer, both Schmidt and Metz neglected the crucial differentiation of religion and politics, whereby Schmidt focuses on the past and the authoritarian political ideas of the counter-revolutionary philosophy, while Metz looks for immanentizing the eschaton in the future. Therefore, Meyer criticizes political theology anyway, if Schmidtian or Metzian style, for representing a very precarious mixing of politics and theology. For Meyer especially, Metz misinterpreted the eschatological reserve as a dangerous, I quote, inner historical not yet, whereby the difference between the Christian message and modern political ideologies practically disappears. Instead of this, Meyer himself played for a public theology, according to which the political dimension and effects of religion can be realized, although these two spheres are seen as being fundamentally separated. On the other hand, this also means that Meyer and Metz share the view that the Christian eschatology definitely implies a public, political, and not only a private dimension. He was only skeptical if it might become possible to indicate the visual relation between religion and politics with the help of the concept of political theology. Thus, Meyer's criticism of Metz repeats nothing but Tauber's argument against Schmidt, that politics and religion, respectively the secular and the spiritual sphere, are separated and intertwined at the same time. From a rather contemporary point of view, Meyer's reservation against political theology and his vindication of public theology is a very German problem the Anglo-American discourse, for instance, does not really differentiate between public religion and political theology. But in Germany, there are still a lot of theologists and political scholars who renounce on using the concept of political theology in order to avoid the suspicion to be and to argue in the intellectual haze of the anti-Semitic Nazi thinker Carl Schmitt. Indeed, it seems to be an irony that it was at least a discussion between Schmitt and Hans Blumenberg in the early 1970s, showing that political theology does not only highlight the inevitable nexus between politics and religion, but also between the secular and the spiritual sphere as such. Along with the Schmitt-Blumenberg discussion, which I must more or less presuppose at this point, I'm coming now to the third and last part of my argument, the reflection of the debate on political theology through the lens of contemporary concepts of the secular. Of course, I have not the time to reflect the countless theoretical approaches towards the secular being formulated within the last decades. Nevertheless, I want to sketch, or at least to mention, some remarkable authors who have exactly outlined the coexistence of religious and secular ideas, values, and lifestyles in modern society as being the unique selling proposition of secular societies as such. In this vein, it was first of all Charles Taylor's monumental book, A Secular Age, which counters a concept of the secular exactly in the described way. Instead of understanding the secularization in the modern world with Max Weber as a process of disenchantment, Taylor assumes the secular as a religious phenomenon itself. Thus, he thinks that secular humanism, individualism, and rationalism are the results of an anthropocentric shift within Christian religion. Consequently, the characteristic outcomes of secularization are by no means to be understood as a loss of faith, or in the diction of Taylor himself, as a subtraction story, but rather as a development that equally includes the option for a non-religious and religious way of life. This means that the autonomous self of modernity has the freedom to choose a religious or non-religious biography. That is also why Taylor prefers to speak of the fragility of religious attitudes as well as the coexistence of secular and non-secular ideas and lifestyles in modern society. Additionally, in contrast to the thesis of Peter Berger presented in the 1960s, Taylor is sure that despite of the constant presence of secular alternatives to religious values and lifestyle, there is no long-term corrosion and relativism of religious convictions, but on the contrary, a consolidation and stabilization of religion in secular societies. Some different kinds of coexistence between religion and the secular in modern society are launched, for instance, by Ronald Inglehart and Pippa Norris, who have examined the parallelism of the sacred and the secular in present time due to the unequal economic welfare in global society. Niklas Luhmann, who treated the secular as a perspective under which religion observes its non-religious environment, Jose Casanova and Jürgen Habermas, with their conceptual innovation of the post-secular, are also Talal Assad's analysis of the formations of the secular, which requires a concept which is not blind for the still existing intersections between religion and politics, particularly in the non-Western but also within the Western world. Hence, in very different ways and also with quite different objectives, all of these authors confirmed the old thesis by Hans Blumenberg that the concept of the secular definitely needs the religious sphere as a point of reference, through whose contrast the secular is constituted at all, even though it always remains interwoven with it. Apparently, this conclusion suggests that the concept of secular actually illuminates nothing but the other side of political theology. While political theology asks about the role of religion in the non-religious secular political world, the concept of the secular is conversely about the question of the relationship between non-religious and religious phenomena and perspectives that is affected by the inevitable encounter of politics and religion. And once again, we realize that both political theology and the secular point precisely to a simultaneous differentiation and intertwining of politics and religion. In summary, we can say that the contemporary debate on the secular identified exactly the same characteristics as being indicators of secularization processes as we have reconstructed before as the features and implications of political theology. Proceeding from this, we are allowed to claim that political theology and the secular could be assumed as two sides of the same coin. Exclamation mark. That is the idea that religion and politics are separated and intertwined in modern societies at the same time. Accordingly, we may also state that the political theology and the secular are nothing but complementary counterterms. Let me make only some concluding remarks. In my eyes, it's definitely no coincidence that the classical and contemporary debates concerning political theology and secularization, respectively, the secular, show them so many parallels, because both debates address the question about the role of religion and theology in the modern secular society. Of course, political theology seems to be the elder discourse, since the relation between politics and religion already belongs to the history of political thought in ancient times, whereas, according to a popular prejudice in the social sciences, the secular and the process of secularization are a significant or even exclusive phenomenon of the modern era. On the other hand, as I have mentioned before, the question about the relation between politics and religion can only occur against the background of secular dynamics, because we need any kind of differentiation of the religious and the political sphere in order to think about the possible or desirable relationship. In this respect, I think that Claude Lefort's brilliant essay about the permanence of the theologico-political makes the decisive point by stressing both politics and religion as being symbolic systems with rather arbitrary lines of demarcation. Thus, for Lefort, being in society as well as consent to a given political regime are both theological, political, and secular moments often ignored by modern notions and conceptualizations of the political. In this way, we may also not forget that the historical appearance of the concept of the political in ancient Greece was reconstructed by Christian Meyer as a process of emancipation from the traditional theogonies and cosmogonies. That means as a secular dynamic as well, which did not change the intersection and contact points between both theos at all. So maybe we can state at the very end of my paper that political theology does not only remind us to the political dimensions of all religions, but also to the pre-modern theological sources of the political, although with and against St. Augustine, it is the secular space where all politics is taking place. Thank you very much for your attention.